talk about failures. And to do that, I want to share with you guys some of my biggest failures, or what felt like my biggest failures back in May. You see, I had a really big failure on a personal level, a 2,000 plus failure. I had this crazy idea that I was going to do a half Ironman. And there was just this one little problem. It involved 89 kilometers of biking, which doesn't have to be a problem unless you've never been on a race bike like I have. But I thought, I'm Dutch. We're made to bike. It should be fine. I'll just get myself a bike. And I invested in a nice race bike and all the gear that came with it, and spent over 2,000 euros on my new hobby, biking. And that also involved clip-on pedals, because apparently that's what you do with a race bike. You clip your shoes into these little pedals. I had no idea how to do that, but I thought it would be fine. Let me start easy. Let me do a 23-kilometer route. It's just an hour. I'm fit. It'll be okay. It's a modest bike route. And so I went out on my brand new bike with all my nice gear, and I got about 2 minutes out when I met my match, what I like to call the evil bump. And it might not look that steep on there, but I promise you it really, really was. It was a steep hill going to a main road with these awful little bumps. And if you don't believe me, Google Street View shows me that even this guy hates it too. It was an awful bump. So I'm going, and I'm braking with both hands, and I think you guys can all guess what happened next. I completely and utterly failed. I damaged my brand new bike, and I decided I am never biking again. What was I thinking? And so I got off my bike. Well, got off my bike. I kind of was already off my bike. I was on the ground. Luckily, my feet had eventually come loose, and I walked my sorry self back to the place I was staying in Spain at the time, thinking I'm never, ever going to bike again. I've failed, and it sucks. And meanwhile, there were several other failures happening, because why not have a few more to add? I was failing at learning Spanish, and I was also failing at a new role. You see, I'd just taken on a new role as interim head of growth for this brand, Wholesup, and they do superfood, high-protein meal shakes focused on people with an active lifestyle. And I was really excited, 2 days a week, helping them grow. Except when I set up the first campaign, it didn't go so well. You see, we knew we had really good retention. We knew people loved the product, but we weren't very good at getting new people on board. So we decided to test paid ads. Except the cost of acquisition was 17 times what it was meant to be. So there I am in a new role with a bruised leg and a very, very bad first campaign. And we've all had those moments where things don't go as planned. And we have knee-jerk reactions to it. We don't like failure. Stephanie talked about this too in a previous talk. Failure is uncomfortable. So we call out things as an organization like, meta-ads just don't work for us, we're not doing that. Or, who's to blame? And we might be a bit more discreet and a bit less direct, but again, Dutch, we're very direct. We might be like, okay, yeah, but who was responsible for this? Or, okay, how can we prevent this happening again? Who do we need to talk to? Or things like, yeah, that's just never going to work for us. And we treat failure as this bad thing, this thing we have to run away from. And we miss out on countless opportunities, in my opinion, because of just one bad campaign, one bad experiment, and we just don't revisit it again. So I'm going to talk more about this today, and I'm going to show you how to set yourself up for failure by telling you a little bit more of what happened after that first lovely bike ride, and what might have seemed like the bigger failure, having such a bad campaign in a new role, why it was actually a better way to deal with failure, and what the difference is between these two examples. Because there are two key things going wrong. It's how we're handling it before, during, and after the experiment, and especially before. And it's also how we're managing stakeholders, again, specifically before. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. We're going to get very practical in how to handle this in a different way. And we're going to start with before the experiment. So before we even think about what experiment we're going to run, we need to have a clear test plan. And this might sound obvious, but a lot of people skip straight to the hypothesis. They don't think about what is this broader thing we're planning. So we need to ask ourselves always first, what is actually the underlying strategy? What are we trying to achieve here? And also, what is the data behind it? What is the quantitative and qualitative data behind this? Because if we remember this, it's also more comfortable when it doesn't work, because we remember the reason why we're doing this. So for WholeSup, we had a growth model. We had somewhere we wanted to go towards. We had certain loops that were working, and parts of it that weren't working yet. We knew we needed to acquire new users, and we knew that paid ads would be a very good channel to do that. We just hadn't figured out yet how to work it. And so we started with a testing plan. We thought about what the goal was, that we wanted to get to a healthy cost of acquisition to lifetime value ratio with it. We also thought about which channels we wanted to test. So in our case, we wanted to do Meta and Google, and then scale what was showing the most promise. We thought about how long we wanted to run these tests for. So 3 months, but in between, we'd look at what the cost of acquisition was to make sure we're on the right track. And so by planning this out, we already had a bigger vision of where we were going, and it wasn't as bad that one test didn't work out, because we never said we were going to run one test and stop. We knew what our measure of success was also, that we wanted to go to this healthy cost of acquisition and lifetime value, which at that point in time was £20. We knew how much we wanted to spend on it, so that the founder wasn't suddenly like, what are you spending all this money on things that aren't working? But I had to choose, how was I going to use that budget to get us towards success? And we also thought about how we were testing. And this is the least important part, but it's still good to think about, because there's so many different ways you can execute a test. And sometimes the one execution doesn't work, but it doesn't mean that you've gotten it completely wrong forevermore. It might just have been that it wasn't the right way. And it doesn't have to be complicated. This is a different client, but it's just a very simple one-pager, just writing out what you're planning to do and having this bigger vision behind it. So this is what it needs to be including. What is our goal? The area we're testing. And so if you're not running ads, you can still think about this, for example, with an experiment. Are we testing the one-time purchase versus subscription? Or are we testing how to reduce friction? What is the theme behind what we're testing? How long are we going to be testing around that area before we reevaluate it? What's the measure of success? Budget and resources, not just costs, but also time put into it. How much are we spending with that? And how do we plan to test it? Because when we treat every single experiment as an individual, we get so much less out of it than looking at it as a series of experiments. Because the first doesn't always win or succeed. Next, you define your hypothesis. And this is something that, again, we talk a lot about, but we just sadly don't do as much as we should be. Really thinking about what is it actually that we're testing and what is the really specific measure of success. Not just when we're running A/B tests, but whenever we're making bigger changes to understand what's working or not. Because a bad hypothesis would be, okay, I need to bike 89K in 5 months, so I should be able to bike 23K. And that's what was going through my mind at the time when I fell off that bike. I thought, if I can't do this, I'm going to fail. But that wasn't true. That was just thinking in black and white instead of actually thinking, hey, what's the next step of what I need? So for WholeSup, after we had that first failure, we devised a new hypothesis about what we needed to do to fix this. Why was it not working? And so we said, because we saw that customers found the current offering confusing, it was like, do you want chocolate or vanilla? Do you want one-time purchase? Do you want subscription? Do you want 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks every the subscription? It's a lot. They found it confusing, and they found it too much because they would only get free shipping if they bought 2 bags. But do you want to buy 2 bags, 30 portions worth if you've never tried it? So we expected by creating a clearer landing page with a simpler and better entry-level offering that we would see at least 50% better conversion. And that might sound like a lot, but this is one of the reasons we get uncomfortable with failure as an organization. If we're very far off it and we're like, look, we've optimized at 5%, but we're still, 16 times what we need to be. So we knew that the conversion rate was so low that if we weren't seeing big wins, we weren't on the right track quite yet. And we also, again, talked about what's the setup then? How are we going to test this? And by doing this, we had really clearly in mind, what are we going to change? And again, making us more comfortable and able to see if it failed, what failed. And we also set up a separate one around the ads because we knew we needed to do a lot more than that. And this might be what gets deemed as a bad experiment, doing two at the same time. But again, failure feels uncomfortable because we think, okay, I've got to do one small change and then get there, rather than breaking the rules a little bit. And we created a separate hypothesis for this reason. We knew that we weren't going to get there just by changing the landing page. And so instead, we measured the ads part of it based on how many engaged people are we getting to the website for a better cost per click. So the hypothesis template is really simple. Thinking about what you see, what you expect, when you're right, and how you want to test it. And this also has the added benefit that when you're learning from all your previous experiments, you can really understand what's been done in the past, so that when they say internally, we tried that, it didn't work, you can say, well, we tried this format, and that didn't work, but that worked a bit better, so what about doing this? Because your experiment is only as strong as your hypothesis. Bad hypothesis, bad experiment. Next, it's time to stress test it. And to do this, I recommend doing a pre-mortem. And it sounds maybe a little bit morbid, but hey, I've already shown you my messed up knee from falling. Might as well make it a bit worse. So a pre-mortem is basically doing this, asking all the what-if questions. Well, if the result is this, what are we going to do? Or if a different metric suddenly decreases, what will we do then? And if it's just slightly worse than we expect, what should we do? That prevents us from getting into this confirmation bias of like, no, it's okay, it's fine, we'll continue with it. But really thinking ahead of time and setting ourselves up for success. Because part of it is getting comfortable with failures, but part of it is also making sure that we don't unnecessarily fail by thinking these things through beforehand. And we did this for WholeSup. We'd already talked about what are we going to do if we get no conversions? Are we going to keep testing or not? At what point will we stop if we kept not getting purchases through meta ads? And we also talked about what we would do if the conversion rate was slightly worse for the new page. Will we continue testing that page, or will we go back to the product page? You see, this could have gone very differently with biking too. If I'd thought this through a bit more ahead of time. This is my partner, Marty, or at least my drawing of him. And he told me, actually, before I got on the bike, he knew a little bit more. He watches Tour de France. I don't, at least not back then. And he was like, you know, do you really want to go straight away for an hour bike ride? Is that really the best way to do it? And I'm like, yeah, it'll be fine. And he's like, do you even know how to clip on pedal? I'm already gone. And he's just thinking, oh. And thankfully, he didn't tell me so. But we can prevent those kind of situations by actually listening. Sorry, Marty. And asking other people to review what we plan to test, how we plan to test it. Because we can be too close to our experiments to see the risk. And again, they won't be as annoyed by the failure or struggle as much with it if they feel a part of it too. I also really recommend doing a numbers double check. So Ethan Garr, who does the Breakout Growth podcast with Sean Ellis, he has this great thing he does. He actually builds the report that he plans to present before he runs the experiment. And that lets him actually check, can I pull the numbers I want? Is everything in the right place? And it's very easy to then run the report, because all he has to do is update it. But it makes sure that he can actually measure what he needs to. And he can show that report to stakeholders and say, is there anything else you're going to need to know? What else do you want to know and understand to be comfortable and confident in what we've tested? And again, then it doesn't feel as bad as a failure because you've got all this information and you can work with it. So we need to also manage stakeholders, the fun part of it all, and manage their expectations. You see, when we're testing, only a few experiments are going to be a success. And we know that, but we're scared to communicate that because we think that everyone just wants to see the successes. And we think that we should just show them the big wins and follow up on the wins and focus on that part. But what you might have thought was a mistake when I was putting lots of dots on my slide was really intentional. These learnings, these failures, they can actually be future winners. They hide a lot of potential. And a lot of my biggest wins at various companies have come from things that failed on the first attempt, just like with the first example. And the other thing we need to be careful about is this win rate, a high win rate. Look how great, we've got such a high win rate. Nope, I don't think it's always good. Because if you've got a really high win rate, it just means you're probably not taking many risks because you're doing the things that you think will work and you're testing safe or within your comfort zone. And as a result, you're also not going to be learning. Because without those failures, there are no learnings of what does and doesn't work. So when we shy away from what doesn't work, we create a culture where we fear failure. And that's a dangerous one to be in. So to sum it up, we need to manage those expectations up front. Usually more will fail than win, and that's okay. And we also need to get that buy-in for that focus area. That plan you created with the first step, walk that through with those key stakeholders. Get the buy-in that you're not just going to run a single experiment and just ping pong between different areas, but really work out once and for all, is it going to work or not? So, testing costs a lot. And it's easy to think it doesn't when we're not spending extra budget on marketing side of it, but it does. It's a lot of resources from dev to design to who's running it, the analyst, all the people involved. We need a certain sample size to have a minimum detectable effect, to know if we have significance. And so a really key thing that we need to do is to be conscious of budgets and show this also to those stakeholders. Because when you talk about that side of it and show that you're conscious of it, not only do you make better decisions by seeing, is it even worth it? Should we be focusing on this? But you also make them more comfortable, especially if you're also showing them, hey, I'm trying to pre-validate things. I'm trying to de-risk things through research as well. And all this, again, builds their trust and makes them also more comfortable when things don't work, and means that they won't end up micromanaging you because one thing went wrong. So they de-risk our chance of failure, and then people see it less as failing, but trying to get a step further. But what about during that experiment? I have one key point for this, and it might sound a bit strange, but I want to encourage you to do some tactical peaking of your experiments. And when we talk about peaking, we talk about all the downsides of it often. And there are downsides to peaking, for sure. We get very excited about a variant winning, and we might share those results. If I'd done that in that first whole sub example, I would have been like, look, we've had the first sale for £15, and we're not getting another one, and we're not getting another one. Oh, God, now it's not anywhere near close to £15 anymore. I would have shared the wrong results. Or we get very discouraged and turn off the test in a panic. I was doing a workshop yesterday for How to Web, and one of the participants mentioned that after 2 days, they found a panic would turn experiments off before they even had a chance to gather any data or enough data. And this is also risky because after just 1 or 2 days, it's not there yet, and it might actually be a success still. Or we increase the chance of a false positive. And this is something I learned from Tom Messing over there. He talks about the fact that the more often we peak and use that as a moment to measure the results, the more chance we have of a false positive. Hey, we've got a winner, because we checked it so often. And this is such a key thing, and one of the biggest learnings I also took away from a course following with him, because I realized I was doing this all the time. So I got better with peaking, but I also realized absolutely stopping peaking wasn't the solution either, because peaking can add some value. 1 day in, make sure the setup's right. I've had it that I thought the test was running, it wasn't running. Thank God I checked after a day. Or once a week, just to make sure it's still going in the right direction and we're not wasting our time. But never, ever, ever to share results. And Michael Agag, another incredible CRO specialist, said this, and I love this idea: give a test a probation period that's equal to half the calculated time. So halfway through the test, we decide, is it a go or is it not? And if it's absolutely terrible, and again, the statisticians are going to hate me for this, but I'm okay with that, we decide to turn it off, because the chances that we get a false negative is, in the sense that we think, hey, it wasn't a winner, and it was, is so low once we've gathered at least a good amount of data, that it's worth saying, let's stop here and not go any further. And again, it makes it less painful and allows us to test more. And what about after the experiment? Really, really take the time to analyze the results. And with this, I mean, ask yourself all those tough questions. Don't just look, this was the figure we were measuring, was it there or not? Okay, great, it's a win, great, it's a failure. For both types, think about what the hypothesis is. What are you testing? What is the qualitative and quantitative data suggesting and that we're seeing here? Can we look at any other sides of it, split it up further and understand what's happening? And Ask yourself, how are we analyzing this in general? Are we doing this in the best possible way? Is there anything else we should be doing every single time? And finally, what did we learn? And this is such a key question for every experiment, winner or failure, okay, learning. What are we learning? So ask yourselves these questions and deconstruct the results. So I always try to look at, like, was it the right audience? Or did we test it with the wrong audience? Was it maybe the wrong platform that we were testing it on? And was that the issue and what we need to learn from? Or did we get the messaging wrong? We've heard also today about how important messaging is. And how about friction? Was there too much friction for what we were asking them to do? Or did we get the execution wrong? Because that can happen too. And looking at it from these different angles can help us understand what's actually going wrong and learn from that experiment. So what actually went wrong when I was biking? I had no idea when to use the front or the back brake, hence the skidding. I didn't know how to go down hills, how I was meant to hold my body, how I was meant to brake, what I was meant to do, which gear I was even meant to use or be in. And I definitely had no idea how to clip in or clip out in the pedals. I was basically testing too much. And that's also a learning. And that's also a way to evaluate and say, hey, this has taught us when we test too much, we can't learn. What should we do differently? So with meta ads, when we ran the follow-up experiment, the hypothesis I showed you, the results were definitely better. We'd gotten it down to a £42 cost of acquisition. Definitely a lot closer than the £342 I showed you in the beginning. The conversion rate was also a lot better at 1.56%, but not high enough because we'd need a really, really low cost per click. And yes, we had better cost per clicks and we had better click-through rate, but not enough to work at that level. So we decided to try and work out what's happening here. And that's the next step. Let's create theories about why this experiment wasn't a win and see what's going on. So for Wholesale, we did this by doing user tests for the page, analyzing heat maps and recordings, checking the analytics, checking the speed, the performance, and we came up with different theories. Maybe the loading time is too slow because 6.5 seconds to interact, whew, that's definitely not great. That's the joy of landing page builders combined with Shopify. The most engaging blocks were very low on the page. Maybe we need to move them up higher. Maybe the copy wasn't effective. Let me rephrase that. The messaging wasn't effective in communicating the value and resonating. And that helps you determine what tests to do next and to turn that failure into that giant opportunity. But it's worth asking yourself, should we keep testing? Is it worth still testing? Or should we stop? And I think it's a fair question because there are cases where you've had several failures and the right thing is to do, hey, it's time to move on for now. So I usually look for a sign that we should continue of having a few of these points. The first is that there's been wins in that area in the past. We've seen that we've had wins there before. And for Wholesale, this wasn't the case. We'd never gotten ads to work for us yet. We were still trying it out. The second is, has it worked for similar brands? Well, that it definitely did. Some of our biggest competitors used paid ads. Do we have further hypotheses? Do we have further ideas of why it's not potentially working and what we can improve on? Yes, we definitely had that. And finally, have we only run 1 to 2 tests in that area? Have we only started scratching the surface? Or have we actually tested loads of different things and it's still not working? And for example, for Google Ads, we ran 7 or 8 different types of tests, from testing different types of campaigns to testing different audiences, and we never got it to work for us, and that's okay. We stopped, we left it, and we invested in meta ads and got that working. And back to, of course, managing the stakeholders along the way. Become a storyteller. Rather than just getting all caught up on the data, share similar experience of where this might have worked for other brands. Talk about the overall strategy, relate it back to where we're going to. Tell a story of what's happening rather than, okay, these were the wins of the week, let's quickly click past the failure because that's uncomfortable. Tell the story about what you're seeing happening and what you plan to do next. And don't just get caught up on the data, speak their language. I've got a lot of data in the slides, I love data, but that's not everyone's language. So a key learning for me when these things happen is speaking their language. What matters to them? What do they want to see that you're doing and looking at to feel confident in the next steps? And to do this, we also need to refrain, and I know I've said the word a lot, but I really do try to talk more about learnings. You just probably would not have made sense of this if I'd said learnings the whole way through instead of failures. But it is a better word. It's not a failure end of the day. It's a way to learn and move ourselves forward. So we did this again at Wholesome. Every single week in our growth meetings, we talked about, what didn't work and what have we learned from it? What were we doing next? Even monthly, when I'm sending an update of how the month went, I have a whole list of things that we want to do different the next month because of what we're seeing. And I share, this went well, this went okay, and this went absolutely terrible. And I don't mind it because I know that the founder's going to be okay with it because we talked about it so openly and so often that he's comfortable with it as well. And we also talk about what we're going to keep doing and stop doing as a result of it all. And finally, we relate it always back to that bigger strategy, as mentioned before. And so these biggest failures might be your biggest wins. Because May might have seemed like a pretty terrible month for me. Falling off my brand new race bike and damaging it, having such a bad first campaign. But actually, I think May was the biggest learning month for me. Because if I had stopped after those failures and given up after that first bike ride, I would never have done the half Ironman after all last month. So I'm so glad I got back on that bike, and it was scary as hell, but it was worth it. And there were still failures along the way. And the same with Wholesome. I'm still on board as the interim head of growth, and we've grown 8 to 9 times since then. Whilst may have been the best month, we got there eventually, learning what worked, continuing to test upon those failures. And there were still failures along the way. September was worse than August. We didn't have the stock to sell, so I couldn't do anything from any forms of marketing, any form of promotion. We had to keep quiet for 3 weeks of the month. But we still kept learning and getting there. So if you can take away one thing, don't let those failures get you down. Go back and conquer the failures. Before I left Spain, I went back to that bump. And I decided I was going to ride over it once and for all. And I look awkward as hell doing it. I know that. It's really not how you should ride a bike still learning. But I'm glad I did it because it made it less scary. And so going back and conquering those failures, that's how we're going to succeed and get the most out of it. Thank you.
Much. Do we have any questions? So you're afraid to talk about experiments or failed ones?
I failed then at this. I've learned from this then.
Well, actually, when you started with the Ironman, I was like, oh no, I'm doing a Spartan now. Will I have the same thing? No, but really, yes, we do have a question, and while the microphone gets there, I think it's very important to have a framework for what to do with these failures, let's say. So yeah, very good content. Please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One question would be, how would you synthesize what you have just said to, I don't know, the management of a company that wants to convince, let's say, maybe their partners or maybe their suppliers that actually learning from a mistake pays off?
Yeah. What is the reason that they would be scared of failure? What's the number one reason? Sorry, the costs. So I think this is a really interesting problem with it because there's the cost of inaction and then there's the cost of action. And so what I would try to do is understand, like, okay, how can we show them that it's usually worth it, the costs in the long term, and also really focus on that part of the budget side of it, of showing them you're being conscious with it, and then showing them also, if it is the financial side, if that's what the data that they're looking at, and they do like the data side, showing them also what the value has been of turning certain failures in the past to wins. I would focus on that part of the puzzle, and also agreeing what the budgets are up front. Really focus on that part of your test plan. Because like I said, if you show them you're conscious of the costs, it feels less scary. What's scary to a founder is when they think, oh, they're being reckless, they don't understand the fact that this is costing lots of money and that there's all these people working on it. So if you show them, look, we know we're going to spend this much time, this is the potential value of it. These are cases where we've, had a similar scenario and ended up getting huge value out of it. Could you be okay with testing it like this? And then after X period, let's check in and see how it's going. I would probably start there based on what you've shared so far.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? One in the back, and then we're going to move to the next speaker.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Can you please share some of the tools that you're using to track the results of the experiments? As in, do you use Google Sheets to to journal
Yeah.
and to see along the way so that you can look back over them and
Yeah.
make a decision? Thank you.
Yeah. So I usually, when a company isn't tracking anything, I usually do start with Google Sheets, or if they're on a Microsoft, which I always hope they're not, but if they're on that, doing an Excel sheet, just to keep it really simple. Because what I found is in the past, I used to start with Airtable, but if they weren't familiar with it, they weren't comfortable with it, all those extra functionalities not worth it because they're not going to use it. So I usually try to keep a really simple first setup. And then once we're running more and more of these growth experiments and getting more learnings and it's becoming unmanageable, then I usually either switch to, if they're using Notion, you can build it into Notion, or you can build it in Airtable as well. So I actually have a whole course on like growth experiment tracking, and I always start Google Sheets, and then only in the last step do I say, okay, these are other options, or building it into your own tool. It really depends on what you're working with. Some tools work with it. Things like Asana are terrible with it. Jira is terrible to run experiments in. I've tried that too. But yeah, just start simple, I always say. In terms of like a specific experiment tracking tool, I've tried some in the past. I haven't actually found one that I felt actually added enough value to do it. I know that some people do use them. Growth Hackers used to have one. I don't know if they still do. I just personally found that they would hinder it more than help it. But end of the day, a tool is just a tool. What matters is what you need and what works for you. So I'm always less focused on like what's the tool need, like what tool is nice or do I like, but rather like what does this organization use, what do they need, what is the challenge, and then choosing based on that.